Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Women Worth and Wellness is now a global brand, which is terrific. We know that COVID brought the world to its knees, and we know that there were lots of new challenges that we were all faced to address. One of the benefits is this whole new Zoom. We're able to do what we weren't able, and the speakers that we have today are exceptional. The speakers that we had last week were out of this world, one from the UK and one from the US. And so we're delighted that you've joined us. Thank you so much. You will receive a replay, so please feel free to share that with others. I do want to mention very briefly, but so important, is Crystal. Crystal has just done an exceptional job of putting all this technology together and doing the profiling and making sure she answers people's questions when they have them. So Crystal, a big, huge thank you. And a special thank you to our sponsors. We have Paul Chapman, who will say a few words. We also have a new one, and that's Power Warehouse. And that is a very, very, very great product that you get fit while you walk by wearing your vest that has weights in it. Crystal and I each have a vest that, as we speak, is being shipped. So we will be wearing that next week, and we'll tell you a little bit more about it. So Paul, maybe come on and just tell us a little bit about you and why you want to sponsor all these Women Worth and Wellness events.
Because you're fantastic. You've been great to work with. It's no, I'm happy to support Women Worth and Wellness and events like this and bringing in such powerhouse speakers. I mean, women are often, it's a big focus on my business. Over, well over half of our business is focused on women and on the estate planning and portfolio management around all that and all the structuring and tax efficiency and all those things. And women are often the stewards of family wealth and actually run over half of all businesses in Canada. So understanding that there are unique challenges there that impact the financial future of women, that's a core focus of our practice and at RBC, and one of the many reasons I joined RBC. So at some point in their lifetime, I believe too, 90% of women they'll be required to play the role of sole financial decision maker. But I've seen research that shows that 2/3 of women are unhappy with the investment industry. So that's something that we're certainly addressing. And there's a focus on our team and needs to be addressed by all of us in the financial services industry. But it's great to work with Nancy. We've been working together for over a couple of years now, and we've done some fabulous events. And this is yet another one with some great speakers that I'm looking forward to hearing from.
And before you go, tell us about your little bean, your little daring and caring up and comer.
My daughter, yeah, you saw that. She's 10 years old and did her first snowboard competition yesterday. So she, in the park, she was very nervous. I was telling you before the call, she was very, very nervous about what her run was going to be and what she could do and should try and all this. And she wasn't sleeping much the night before, but she won her division, so she was pretty pumped last night about it.
Excellent.
It's pretty cute.
So we're going to keep the spirit going, daring and caring. Doesn't matter what age you are. Okay.
She's certainly a firecracker, so she has no problem there.
Super. Okay, Crystal. Thanks, Paul. Crystal, I'll turn it back to you to introduce Shari, please.
Perfect. We have our first speaker, which is Shari Graydon. Shari has spent more than 30 years engaging media to draw attention to issues she knows and cares about. And now she motivates and trains others to do the same, developing and delivering high-rated conference keynotes and practical workshops across the country. She's the catalyst of informed opinions. She's an award-winning author and a woman's advocate. And since 2010, she has helped amplify the voices of thousands of women across Canada, supporting them and sharing their insights with a broader public. We are very honored to have you here with us, Shari. Shari, please join us. Oh, you are muted.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you. Nancy asked me to share 3 nuggets, so I'm going to do that over the course of telling a couple of stories and giving you a bigger picture context for the work that I do, Informed Opinions does, and why you should care about all of it. So I joined the board of Informed Opinions predecessor Media Watch, which some of you may be familiar with, almost actually 30 years ago. And at my second board meeting, I went to the bathroom at the wrong time. And when I came back, I was president. Because, and some of you probably know this, there are no glass ceilings in underfunded women's organizations, which we were. As a board member, I started to get invited to comment on news stories that intersected with our mandate, which was to specifically improve the portrayal and representation of women and girls in the media. And because media have the power to influence everything else, they shape attitudes, they set agendas, they influence public spending and priorities, we were really on purpose to improve women's portrayal in the media. And so in 1991, when I got a call, I was living in Vancouver at the time, I got a call from BCTV, the biggest TV station in British Columbia, informing me that the Miss Canada pageant had just been canceled. And they needed someone who was not a beauty contestant to come on and talk about it. Now, the reporter didn't actually frame it that way, but that's absolutely what he meant. So I had worked in public relations. I thought strategically, knowing that I was only going to get one quote, I thought strategically about what I wanted that quote to be. I went out into the front steps of my apartment building. I looked into the reporter's camera and said how thrilled I was that a contest treating women's bodies like cattle at an auction was no longer popular enough to support advertisers. I went back up into my apartment a couple of hours later. The news hour aired. I watched it. They used my clip and I felt momentarily elated. And then my ordinarily supportive mother called me on the phone and she said, "Honey, you looked awful." For the record, I looked fine. It was 30 years ago. I was a little pale because it was January. But in my mother's defense, I think it was her first appreciation of the fact that despite my many charms, I was not beauty contestant material. And because she was my mother, she had never noticed that before. But the starkness of the contrast between Miss Canada 1990 and Miss Canada 1991 and me made it really evident. I tell you this story not to dissuade you from going on television, should you ever have the opportunity to share what you know and influence public attitudes. Just, pinch your cheeks or wear a little lip gloss. I tell you the story because for me, despite my mother's criticism, it was a resounding success in that I had been really strategic and thoughtful about using a dramatic visual analogy. And so that when I did speak to the camera, speak to the journalist, I was successful in ensuring that the message I wanted to deliver made it onto the supper hour, which would have been seen by potentially, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions. So my first takeaway is really this one, and it's something that is the basis for so much of what we do to Informed Opinions, and that is that brilliance without the capacity to communicate it effectively is often overlooked. And one of the things that made us start Informed Opinions 13 years ago was realizing that in the newspaper that I read every day, I did a cursory content analysis study off the side of my breakfast table over the course of a month in 2009. And every morning what I did was I counted up what percentage of the op-ed page contributors, either op-eds or columnists, were women versus men. And in 2009, it was about 24%, which I thought was unacceptable. And part of my context for that was that in 1990, early 1990s, when I first joined the board of Media Watch, we had done similar studies and found that in media overall, not just on the op-ed page, but in terms of newspapers across the country, women were only being quoted about 20 to 22% of the time. And that was a problem in the 1990s. It's still a problem in 2023 because, as I mentioned, the news media have the power to influence everything else. And in 2023, there's absolutely no excuse for journalists not to be quoting women, for women not to be sharing the depth and breadth of their knowledge and expertise. And so we started Informed Opinions very narrowly with the specific goal to train women who know stuff about everything, to translate that knowledge into short form commentary that could be available and influence and educate everybody else. So that's still a big part of what we do. We deliver workshops that train women how to write op-eds, how to become more effective in media interviews, how to ensure that the research they're doing as academics or policy people gets into the hands of governments and policy people at the governmental level who have the capacity to translate it into something that will affect everything else. So that was our primary ambition, was to start workshops and make workshops available to women across the country. We still continue to do that. I'm just going to put the link to the workshop page in the chat function so you can visit it later. We've now trained probably more than 5,000 women across the country, and more than 1,000 of those have had their thought leadership pieces published in major daily newspapers, on CBC's commentary hub across the country. They're amplifying their own profile in the process. They are helping to change conversations. We've had very effectively women who have ended up changing legislation, who have ended up getting appointed to prestigious boards or panels or even the Senate, in part as a result of their amplified profile and people's understanding that they had something to contribute that was missing. So I want to give you a little context for the missing piece. In 2005, so before I started Informed Opinions, but in 2005, my husband and I were in Montreal, and we were cutting across the parking lot of a Catholic church on René Lévesque, and a television crew doing streeter interviews where they interview anybody who passes by, no expertise needed. They stopped us and said, "The Pope has just died, would you comment?" And I said, "No, I don't think so," and kept walking. My husband, who had not been to church for 40 years, he stopped and said, "Sure, I'll comment." And I turned around stunned, wondering what pearls of wisdom would drop from his beautiful mouth. I watched him bow his head and gravely declare, "It's a very sad day for Catholics everywhere." And as we continued on our walk to the Old Port where we were going for dinner, I turned to him and said, "Honey, it was a little obvious. And wouldn't it have been great if the next Pope were to come in with a new policy on birth control that wouldn't trap millions of poor Catholic women around the world in an endless cycle of childbearing and child rearing?" And David, good feminist that he is, said, "Yeah, Shari, that would have been great. Too bad you turned down the interview. Too bad didn't begin to describe it." Number one, I had been the president of Media Watch for 10 years. I had done the research documenting the underrepresentation of women in the media, and I knew what the consequences of that were. Number two, David got on national news. His comments were disseminated to millions of people across the country. And if I had been willing to step up and speak into the camera on that occasion, like I had in 1991, I too could have potentially changed a conversation to make people think about something that really only affects women. And here's my context. I had spent at that time the vast majority of my life either trying to become pregnant, like most women, either trying to become pregnant, trying to avoid becoming pregnant, or dealing with the consequences of having been pregnant, which, as felicitous as they may be, last forever and change everything. So women's realities on purely a biological basis are often profoundly different than our male counterparts. And on top of that reality, there are all sorts of contexts in which we experience the world differently. We're more afraid in underground parking lots. We are more likely to be paid less than our equally qualified male counterparts. We know that unconscious bias continues to have a huge impact on the opportunities that women are given, on how we're perceived, on how we're treated, on how we're paid. Women are also, and the pandemic made this really clear, we are the caregivers. We are the social safety net. We are the ones who not only bear much more responsibility for raising children, but also taking care of our elders at the end of their lives. And so all of these experiences really shape and influence what we think about, what we prioritize, the solutions that we're likely to come up with. So this is my second point, my second takeaway, and that is that we cannot, in Canada, everywhere in the world, effectively address the complex social, economic, and environmental issues that we're facing without women holding a balance of power, without women being at every decision-making table that exists in business, in the nonprofit sector, in the education sector, in universities, in research. We have now probably 30 years worth of data looking at the difference that is made to scientific research teams, to corporations, when women are at the table and sharing their insights and influencing decisions that are being made. One of my favorite stories to tell is about Christine Lagarde, who at the time was she was finance minister of France at the time. Then she went on to become the head of the International Monetary Fund. After the 2008 financial collapse, somebody asked Christine Lagarde in an interview, what could have been done to avoid the global financial collapse? And she said, I must confess, if only Lehman Brothers had had a few sisters, we wouldn't be in this mess. Now, research backs her up. Hire more women, higher up, and worldwide financial markets would be more stable, because where many men take risks for short-term gain, they've been socialized to do that, more women consider consequences and the long-term implications of the decisions that they're making. And so research makes clear when women are more present in financial markets, our entire financial system globally and individually in individual countries is more stable. So that's just one concrete example, but there are many others. We know that women and children are more likely to be devastated by the impacts of climate change. We know that peace treaties last longer when women are at the table where they're being made. We know that women in C-suites are more likely to come up with policies that not only increase return on investment, but also make workplaces happier places. And it's not that women are better than men, it's just that we experience the world differently. We're half the population, and without being present in all of those arenas, things get missed, as they would if women were at 70 or 80% instead of 50 as well. One of the things that I wanted to mention about the way we're attempting to address the underrepresentation of women in the media to help change this, because if you see more women in the media, you hear more from them, you have a better understanding of all of these issues, is we created an experts database that's free to the women who appear in it, and is free to the journalists who access it. And the database is really just designed to make sure that a journalist can never again say, well, I would have quoted a woman, but I couldn't find one who's qualified. There are thousands of really qualified women across the country who are also empowered to speak to the media. And that's what our database does, is feature those women. The last thing that I wanted to mention was the work that we're doing around politics. So we have a gender gap tracker, which is an online tool, you can Google it, that measures in real time the ratio of men versus women being quoted. And what we found a couple of years ago was that 60% of the most quoted men and women were politicians. So I went to Equal Voice, which is a great organization doing work to amplify and build up women's presence in politics, and said, I can't achieve my mandate till you achieve yours. What are you doing and how can I help you? And so over the last year, we've been launching a Balance of Power project specifically aimed at educating Canadians about what a difference it makes when women are present in politics, and how many of countries around the world have really taken aim at this. If I had the capacity to poll you right now, I would ask you, where do you think Canada ranks relative to other countries? So I'm going to ask you to mentally answer that question. Do you think we are 10th or 15th relative to other countries? Do you think we're 25th in terms of the presence of women in our politics? When I started this project a year and a half ago, I thought we were in the top 20. We're not. We're not even in the top 30. In fact, Canada is now 62nd in the world in terms of the representation of women in our politics. So across the country, 30.5% of MPs are women. That means 69.5 are men. And that is an imbalance that really doesn't serve us. And there are 61 countries around the world that are doing a better job of this. And mostly they're doing a better job because they've invested concerted energy in working to make change. So our Balance of Power project is really designed to encourage politicians and the public to better understand the implications of women being so underrepresented, and to get on the program and be concrete about their solutions. And I have some ideas about that. I'm out of my time. I think I've spoken for my allotted time, and I'm looking forward to any of your questions about any of the things that I've raised. And I'm looking forward to hearing Frances speak and having a conversation with her as well.
Shari, we're delighted that you are doing everything that you're doing, because it's daring and caring to the max. And it's women's leadership for positive impact. The reason why we chose this whole theme is post-COVID, we've got new opportunities, and we can now see that the world needs us to step up. I love your comment about stepping up and to address whatever we can with our own unique ability. So more leadership is definitely needed by women. And it reminds me of a quote by Barack Obama, where he said, "The world needs more Canada." So we say the world needs more women leaders who are stepping up, and, Lehman Brothers, Lehman Sisters, that's a perfect example. That's wonderful. Really, really good.
I just realized I had forgotten to give my third takeaway, so I've put it into the chat. And that comes out of the 60-second spot, that we need, as women in this country, to stop accepting incremental change and to ask for bolder action of the kind that is happening in many countries around the world. And
Okay,
that could probably go outside of politics as well.
Let me ask you a question right now. Who is a woman leader that you can think of right now who is stepping out and stepping up and really making a difference?
I think Jacinda Ardern is a really obvious example. This is a woman who's been leading New Zealand for a number of years. She gave birth while in office. She has taken really concerted aim against gun violence in her country. She was a leader in terms of how they managed the response to the pandemic and how they've come out of that. And I am consistently impressed with her ability to bring her sensibility, her lived experience as a woman to the challenges of governing on behalf of the entire population.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, Crystal, I'll turn it over to you, and perhaps you can introduce Frances, and we'll hear what Frances has to say. And Frances and Shari have been mutual admirers of one another, but have never had a chance to spend time together. So they were both delighted that they were. And of course, when people chose their date, it was based on your availability. So it's really, really wonderful that these two have teamed up. So Crystal, over to you.
Yes, it's funny how things happen. So Frances, we have Frances right here next. After earning a BA in psychology and sociology from the University of Calgary and completing the Canadian Securities course, Frances moved to Ottawa to work on Parliament Hill and complete an honors B journalism at Carleton. So from 1996 until 2005, Frances had the pleasure of serving as the co-founder and CEO of the Famous Five Foundation. And as of January last year, Frances became the CEO of the Famous Five Foundation, once again in preparation for the 95th anniversary of the Persons case on October 18th, 2024. I hope you'll be sharing a little bit about that, Frances. And she welcomes any suggestions and participation throughout the presentation. So Frances, we're so delighted to have you here. Please join us.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And as Nancy just said, I have been an admirer of Shari for many, many years. And she even came and spoke at the Famous Five Foundation a number of years ago, for which I am very, very grateful. One of the things you might want to do is to buy Shari's book called OMG. It's fantastic. And it has a number of the stories that Shari has told, but in a little more detail, and some wonderful graphics that just put into perspective the economy would tank without women's work. The other one, the ripples we create by speaking up are incalculable. It's true. And talking is the antidote for oppression and injustice. And I would add probably also depression, for women to speak up and to say what are the issues that matter to them. Certainly for the Famous Five, the issue that got them together was the fact that although women were voting, and there was a woman sitting in the House of Commons, and that of course was from Ontario, Agnes MacPhail. And the House had passed two bills, one to establish old age pensions, and the second to establish mothers' allowances paid to mothers. And when those bills got to the Senate, which is our supposedly sober second thought house, the pale, male, stale, frail senators objected to both of them. To the old age pensions, they said, well, if a person is old, they should have saved enough along their life to make sure that they have enough money in their old age. Or secondly, they should have cultivated their family and friends so that others take care of them. It should not be the responsibility of other people. But the piece of legislation that really ticked off, particularly Emily Murphy, the first female judge in the British Empire, was the lack of support for mothers' allowances. And this really infuriated the senators. They were aghast that their money that they had earned and had paid in taxes were simply going to go to women who knew nothing about business, women who didn't know how to properly spend the money. And so sitting back in Edmonton was Judge Emily Murphy. She had been very much involved with a number of issues, including establishing the Women's Press Club, so that women were obviously working in all aspects of life within the industry. But of course, at that time, they were not. She established a review of mental hospitals. She did a number of things, but I would say, as I start to tell you about the Famous Five too, that they were not perfect, that they believe some things that are unacceptable or that have not withstood the test of time. But Emily was a doer, and she decided that if we could get 4 other women together, we could use a clause that was in the Supreme Court of Canada Act, it isn't there anymore, that said 5 Canadians could ask the government, could ask the Supreme Court to clarify a word, a phrase, or a clause. So she wanted the word persons clarified. Does the word persons in Section 24 of the BNA Act, the British North America Act of 1867, include female persons? So she writes letters. So the first letter she writes to is Louise McKinney. And Louise was living in Claresholm, south of Calgary. And she had established the Women's Christian Temperance Union, working to make sure people weren't drinking too much, and also that the care packages that went to the soldiers in World War I didn't include cigarettes. So she came and said, yes, I will help. And by that time, Louise had become the first woman ever to be elected in the British Empire. Both Liberals and Conservatives asked her to be a candidate in the very first election in which women could run. Alberta was the third province to give women the right to vote, but the first to hold an election in 1916. And Louise says to the two main political parties, do you take contributions from liquor companies? And they both said yes. And she then said, I'm not going to run for you. I'll run as an independent. And I think statistics are less than 2% of independents are elected. And of the 2% that are elected, generally they have served as a member, have been elected as a member of another party. So Louise said, yes, I'll come and sign your petition. The second person she invited was the Honorable Irene Parlby, who was the first woman in Alberta to serve as a cabinet minister. In 1921, Louise was defeated because Albertans decided they wanted to drink everywhere at any time. But two people were elected, and one of them, two women were elected, and one of them was Irene Parlby, who had come from England, from a political family, and had decided to stay after she met Walter Parlby. She goes on to establish the United Farm Women of Alberta, who were largely responsible for developing the policies of the United Farmers of Alberta and raising much of their money. And she said she stayed in Canada because Canada is a place where women talk about policies and principles, not just about petticoats and petits fours. So of course, when she received the invitation in 1927 to come to Emily's house the end of August to sign this letter, she said, yes, I'm definitely coming. The third person that Emily sent a letter to lived in far south of Alberta in Fort Macleod, and that was Henrietta Muir Edwards. Now, Henrietta, like some of the others, had grown up in different parts of Canada. She had grown up in Montreal. And when she and her sister noticed that women were coming to town to get jobs, and they were coming from out of the country to live in a new country, many of them paid their rent, but then found that they were kicked out before the end of the month, that their rooms were ransacked by the landlords, or indeed they were sexually harassed, or indeed sexually abused. So Henrietta says to her father, because he owned a number of houses, can my sister and I please have one house, and we will make it a safe house for women? And so he agrees. And after a while, the two sisters noticed that these women needed help in applying for jobs, in understanding the responsibility of a job, and for many of them, for learning English as a second or third language. And it's generally considered to be the prototype for the Canadian YWCA. Then Henrietta looks around and her friends, and they notice that so many people are very, very sick, and they don't know too much about modern medicine, about doctors, and also they are not able to pay to go to a doctor. So she and her friends say, can't we at least let a nurse come and look after these people? And thus they started the Victorian Order of Nurses. Then she meets with the wife of the Governor General, who is interested in the women's issues about suffrage and about education, access to education, about equal pay. And they established the National Council of Women, bringing together all the women's groups. The fourth, well, before I just leave Henrietta had to get on the train for 5 hours to travel from Fort Macleod all the way up to Edmonton. It was a hot, dusty plane ride, but she did it, even though she'd done those other things. The fourth person who came to sign the petition to have women declared persons and therefore eligible to serve in the Senate was, of course, Nellie McClung. And Nellie had secured the breakthrough for women in Manitoba in terms of suffrage. And Manitoba was the very first province to grant women the right to vote. Interestingly enough, Nellie was also asked by the very prominent American suffragists to come to the States, mainly the East Coast of the States, to talk about why women should have the right to vote. So we Canadians have a wonderful history of these women leaders. And in fact, Emily Murphy said at one time, I believe there never was a country better adapted to produce a great race of women than this country of Canada, because they are brave. And that's us. That's us. And this is what Nancy and Shari are trying to help us do, is to realize that we are important too, that we have a role to play in the building of Canada. And unlike the famous five, who didn't have phones, who didn't have computers, who didn't have social media, who didn't have planes, what they achieved was a transfer of power. What we have are computers, our phones, social media, planes, better education, more connections within Canada. So it really is upon us to speak out, to run for office, to say, yes, I will accept being the president of a Fortune 500 company, to follow Shari's example with a not-for-profit company, because not-for-profits have played an important role in affecting the laws, the legislation, the culture of Canada. So it's important that we realize that minding our own business isn't enough. We are proteges of the famous five. We have been given a country that is open to us to help to overcome some of the obstacles. And the obstacles, as Shari has so eloquently mentioned, unfortunately still remain. In 2023, we're still paid 11 cents on the dollar if we work full time and have some other qualifications. If we are racialized women, the difference between the pay of a white man and a racialized woman is something like 35 cents. Why is this? Part-time. We still get 30% less than what a man gets for the same part-time job, for the same responsibilities, for the same education. So it's up to each and every one of us now to come forward, because we have people like Shari Graydon who tell us, who show us, who inspire us to take part. And we have people like Nancy Griffin who give us the opportunity to practice, to network, to learn a little bit more about the issues. So what I would like to do now is to have a conversation with Shari, if I may, because there are a number of questions that I would love to know the answers, as she and I both work in this area, but want others to join us. And I often say, the name Francis, it means Francis and Friends, because it takes one or two of us to start something. We may have an idea, but now studies show that the most important person often is the first follower. Would you agree, Shari, that it's the first follower that comes along, and then the next follower, and then you start talking, and then you go public with your message?
Well, I think it's true that you can't really be a leader if you don't have followers. And it is often, having just said we should reject incremental change, you know, the way you build a movement or followers, absolutely. It needs to start with one person being inspired or signing onto your petition, and then others are more likely to join in. I so appreciated you unpacking the incredible accomplishments of those five women, Francis. It's pretty inspirational what they accomplished.
Yes, and when you think about, some of them, Nellie was burnt in effigy for suggesting that women have the right to vote and run for office. It was a dual victory that they achieved. And then at parts of Canada, although the province gave women the right to vote, they didn't give them the right to run for office until a later age. Like the men, they could vote at age 21, but the women could only run for office, Shari, when they turned 31. And in the 1930s, that dissuaded a lot of women. Isn't it interesting the subtle ways we are dissuaded?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I was reminded of when you were speaking, Francis, and I mentioned this to you last week, that Constance Backhouse, who is a legal historian at the University of Ottawa, once gave a talk for us at an event we had on October 18th. And she mentioned how where these women were in their lives when they went to the Privy Council and got persons being recognized. And I think you corrected me. So one was in her 50s, the others were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, which for me was a reminder that when you're working on behalf of the rights of women, of Indigenous people of color, anybody who is still disadvantaged and discriminated against, there's no retiring. the work is ongoing. Yeah.
Exactly. One of the ways we at the foundation are trying to encourage women to be leaders or bolder leaders is through our virtual pink tea series, which we do once a month, usually the first Friday. We say it's a famous 5 Friday, when women have more power and see more opportunities and hopefully seize more opportunities. And on February the 3rd, it's a woman called Sharon Hapton, who looked around. I think she was in her 50s. That's right. She had a birthday party for her 50th birthday and said, Canada still has poverty. Canada still has people faced with food insecurity. So what I would like to do is I would like to set up a series of evening events where you, a volunteer, pay $55 and come to a facility, and we're going to make soup. And guess what? You're not going to keep the soup. The soup is going to go to organizations that need it, to women's shelters, to frontline workers, to homeless shelters. And when COVID came, that could no longer happen. And by that time, she had volunteers in 25 or 27 cities across Canada and also into the States. So she very smartly, or had the courage to adapt, to evolve, and worked with a food production agency in Edmonton and with a delivery company that was known for its freezer capacity called VersaCold. And she continues. And now I think she's had served something like 3 to 5 million bowls of soup. And it's more than just the soup. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is because Shari is going to be part of that discussion too. So Shari, thank you very much for participating, agreeing to participate. What are the thoughts that you have as you think about your friend Sharon and what she has accomplished?
Oh, well, I've just met Sharon a month ago, but we live in the same building.
Oh.
So she's a few floors up above me, and I think she's on the call here. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. We've already gotten together and talked about, the work that she's doing is really micro in the community. It's meeting needs on the ground of women who are fleeing unfortunate situations with their children often. And so this is making sure, as you said, that they have access to warm, nutritious, delicious soup. And so we're going to do an event in our building to talk about the sort of frontline service work that Sharon and her soup makers do, and the bigger picture systemic change work that Informed Opinions is trying to do by shifting attitudes and structures and systems to ensure that, because we need both. We need folks on the ground doing the great work that Sharon is doing, and we need to change the systems themselves that are stacked against people who are still being disenfranchised, not in terms of their vote, but in terms of the impact.
Yeah, and particularly in distress, right? They're in distress. But so Shari, also tell us a little more about the writing of op-eds. You talked about being interviewed, and that's often hard for people to do, but almost all of us can write an op-ed. So would you tell us how best to do that and why we should do that?
Yeah, and thank you so much for the question. We have, although we offer workshops that walk you through a process that makes it much easier to write an op-ed, we also have a whole bunch of resources on the website that are free. But really, there are a few key components. It's one, you first of all have to have an informed opinion about the issue that you're writing about. We might all have opinions about things, but if we don't know very much about them, nobody's going to publish them. So you have to have an informed opinion. Ideally, you need a news hook. You need the issue that you want to write to be in the news right now, or something related to the issue you want to write about to be in the news, so that when you send your draft op-ed to the editor, you can say, people are talking about this right now, you should make space in the paper or online for it. You need to build an argument. So essentially, an op-ed is a short form persuasive case. Usually you get about 700 words, and you need to have a clear focused thesis and then have evidence to back up that thesis. And this is probably the most important thing that people, I think, underestimate is you want to write it in a way that engages people, makes them think, oh, I care about this, given the way you're framing it. So it's not just data and facts.
Right.
You need to reach people emotionally and demonstrate to them why this is important. What are the consequences of us not doing anything about it? What are the solutions? And in my experience, women are really focused in very pragmatic ways on not just pointing out the problems. We have opposition benches full of politicians willing to point out the problems, but on the op-ed pages, being able to offer a solution and saying, this is wrong, this is better, this is what we should do instead. Those are all pieces that are important. I just want to mention also, because the op-eds have been really critical to us measuring our impact. When I first started Informed Opinions, people would say, well, what difference will it make if women are writing more op-eds or are being quoted more often? And it's hard to measure an absence. And so one of the things we did was we took 100 op-eds written by the women we had trained that were then published in the Calgary Herald and the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star and the Montreal Gazette. And we created word clouds from those op-eds. And then we created a comparable word cloud out of op-eds written by men. We deducted the common words so that we were left with words and issues that only came up when women were writing. And
Interesting.
we're in the process of redoing this, but let me just share some of the words that came up, and some of them are completely predictable, like child, family, sexual assault, female, girls. Those are all prominent in the word cloud, but so are words like racism and police, evidence and impact, food and water. Not that men don't care about those things, but when they have op-ed space, that's not what they're writing about.
I'm going to interrupt Francis, just so we very quickly run out of time. I really want to comment on behalf of Madeleine Albright to say that you two are both going to heaven, straight to heaven, because she said women who do not support there's a special place in hell for women who do not support other women. So Francis, for you to start off promoting Shari's book is exceptional.
Yes.
But it's a fabulous book. It's very practical. It's very inspiring, and it's funny. There's some and touching. It's poignant too, isn't it, Shari?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
The other thing that I want to just insert here before we run out of time is we're planning on doing a mind, body, spirit boot camp, May the 11th at Magna Golf Course. And it's all about helping women get the right mindset, make sure you're healthy, and to step it up and really make a difference for positive impact the way we know we want women to do. Also, our speaker last week, Lisa, is at Davos this week, and she and Kieran are coming back again on February the 6th to tell us what in the world she may have learned at Davos. Crystal, I'll pass back to you because you may have some questions in the chat that you want to present.
Thank you, Nancy. All right, I do. Well, what country, you spoke about this, Shari, about Canada being 63rd of all the countries that have women in power. So what country has the most women in power?
Boy, I should memorize the top 10. What I can tell you is most of them are Nordic countries, although, so Iceland, New Zealand are both in the top 10. Mexico, this will surprise many people, I'm guessing. Mexico is number 4th.
Oh.
And that's because they changed their constitution a few years ago to ensure that, and I forget whether it's a party issue, but here's the short story. Many of these countries around the world have implemented, I hope you're all sitting down, a quota system. And I know quotas is a bad word in lots of circles, but I have become convinced over the last 10 or 15 years that quotas are necessary, not just for women, but to ensure that we have better representation.
I think you're absolutely right, Sherry. And I think one of the things is the name that of quota. I think if we can change it to be target or goal, but it does mean we have to achieve that particular number. You know, you asked earlier who are some of the women that Sherry admired, and I just want to put in a plug for a couple of Canadian women, and one of them is Caroline Cochrane, who is the Premier of the Northwest Territories, because she has lived a difficult life and then saw a different path thanks to her friends, and she's ended up now as the Premier of the Northwest Territories. And we come back to the importance of leaders, particularly political leaders, because their laws, their legislation affects all of us. Thankfully, we've had some smart political leaders because, for example, Canada does not have an abortion law. Abortion is simply a health care matter, which is where it should be. Sorry, Nancy, I just thought I would add that.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Crystal, any other questions?
Yes, this is one we like to ask every speaker. What would you tell your 20-year-old self if you knew then what you know now? We'll start with you, Sherry.
Wear sunscreen, and it only gets better. My mother said to me when she was in her 50s that her 50th decade were the best years of her life at that point. And I'm 64 now, and I have to say I feel stronger and more creative and more effective than I ever have been, and I never would have predicted that. The messages to women are that, you know, once the wrinkles start appearing, you're done, and that's so not the case.
No, absolutely not. I'm actually a little older than you, Sherry. I'm 75. And I think that people in their 50s and 60s are really at their prime. And the 70s are more to mentor or advise younger women coming forward. But you clearly, Sherry, have lots more potential, and your message is so well honed that I think more people are going to start appreciating what it is you have been doing all these years. The advice I would give to my 20-year-old self, because I was a very shy person. I think of myself as a bit of an introvert, but I'm determined to make some changes. I'm an immigrant to Canada, and I really appreciate what people have contributed to Canada and made my life better. And that's why I became one of the key people determined to update our anthem or restore our anthem to a gender neutrality. And so it took me nearly 20 years. It started with Girl Guides being part of the famous 5 events that happened across Canada, and the fathers coming to me and saying, you saw how wonderful my 14-year-old was, but then we sang the anthem. And it only encouraged the sons to be involved, but it's my daughter who wants to be involved. And so that's why, after consulting linguists and working with all kinds of fabulous people, including Senator Vivian Poy and Senator Nancy Ruth, that the suggestion was made for us to say, true patriot love in all of us command, all of us. Canada truly needs all of us. So no matter what your skill is or your station in life or your time in life, you are a leader. The question is, do you know what you are leading about or how your leadership is affecting others? And be proud of yourself and do many of the things that Sherry advocates in terms of making others aware of the issues that are important to you.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question here. What are the best few tips that a woman who leads a foundation in facing some men's criticism? What are some tips you can suggest, Sherry?
Boy, it really depends on the man and on the criticism. I like to quote Ezra Pound, the American poet, who said, pay no attention to the criticism of men sick who have not themselves written a powerful work. So if the criticism that you're getting, I get criticized often, and I invite criticism from my staff and my board. And so some criticism is useful because it helps you improve. But If the criticism is not adding value, is not helping you become more effective, and or if it's coming from someone who you don't respect, who hasn't themselves run a foundation, then yeah, I would say ignore it. Thank you for sharing. Period.
I'm not sure I would even be that gracious, Sherry, but I do think to myself, everything that you have just mentioned, to evaluate from whence the criticism is coming, and is there a kernel of truth maybe that would help us do better. But eventually you do what you set out to do. You keep your word, and you're involved with other people. And so you consult with them and you work with them about how to do something better or different. So it's not just oneself, it's a team that goes forward. And, you know, Nellie McClung said on many occasions, no nation rises higher than its women. So we are the women of Canada. So let's rise. We have everything going for us, everything. And now many of us have a new network of friends we can call on to bounce off an idea or to ask for their help or to ask for their support. So it is incumbent that for true patriot love, all of us should be in command.
Wonderful. You ladies are fabulous. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
What a pleasure. Amazing. Next week we have Desiree from Calgary. I think you may know her, Francis. She's an IWF member. I don't know if Sherry does or not, but exceptional. I heard her
Yes.
story in Toronto and invited her, and she's joining us. And the other one is Carolyn from South Africa, who's all about governance. And so it will be another robust, interesting, illuminating event. So please register. Crystal, make sure that you get all the information more in depth, and by all means register. It's no charge, thanks to Paul Chapman and our sponsors. And what else can I say, Crystal?
Just one thing I'll say, I'll put the link into the chat, but as well as either later today or first thing in the morning, you will get a copy of the replay of this event, and as well as the link to the invite for next week's events to register. And we please do encourage you to share with your colleagues, friends, anybody in your network.
Everybody's welcome. Please
Yeah.
come. Please come.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's it. We're a minute early. But
Last thing is
I'll thank Sherry and Francis again. That was exceptional.
Pleasure.
And definitely something to think about. And I really want to work with you, Francis, on getting some events in place for October the 18th, those pink teas.
Thank you.
Let's do it.
Person state. Yes. Pink teas were because if the suffragists put up the notice saying, come to our suffrage meeting, the opponents would come and knock over the furniture and shout and scare people. And so the women said, well, why don't we just have teas, and then we'll see who comes. But more than likely than not, we're going to talk about suffrage. And of course, now we know some women in Quebec and the Maritimes added a little sherry to their tea. So pink teas are for activists. So have your own pink tea and join Nancy and Crystal next week and the Mondays thereafter.
Perfect. Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
And
Thanks,
just
Crystal.
to note, everybody, that a survey is just going to pop up. It's going to come right up on your screen as soon as the meeting ends. Please just take that extra minute. We value your feedback for this event here, as well as for any future events. So please take that time for us. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.